Thank you all so much for being here. It really means a lot because in a lot of ways, Neurocracy wouldn't exist without AdvX. So the fact that I'm now standing here talking about it to all of you, it's a bit of a moment. So thank you all so much for being here. As the slide might give away, my talk is going to be about how it took bringing together a community of players and peers in order to ultimately bring Neurocracy to life in ways that I could have never hoped or dreamed. I'll introduce myself first. I'm Johannes Truyens. That's me right there with my very supportive, not at all demanding cat, Vigo. I was born in Belgium. I currently live in London, and I'm a game writer and narrative designer. Game writing is something that I've always been interested in and interested in doing, and when I learned about the title of narrative design in around 2009, it immediately felt like something that I wanted to do. As nebulous as the term was back then, and I still find people explaining it on Twitter every couple of months, it felt like a right fit. I wanted to do narrative design. So I started a blog in 2009 called Playthroughline that I used to explore the role of narrative in games, narrative design. And I also wrote a series of satirical scripts, sort of patterned like they were movie adaptations of the games that I was playing at the time. And that's sort of how I engaged in critical analysis of game narratives. I've got the one for Deus Ex Human Revolution here because a couple of years ago I met one of the writers of that game. And when he learned who I was, he told me that that script had been passed around the office a couple days after release. So hopefully they had a good laugh. I was also active as a game journalist for a while, and between 2013 and 2016 I worked on my first two games. The first one was Wolf, the Red Hood Diaries from a Belgian studio, which was an action platformer with a dark twist on the classic fairy tale, which was the style at the time. And the other one was Iron Fish from a British studio, which was a psychological horror game where you explore the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean in search of a lost civilization. With both of these games, it was less narrative design and more game writing. I came into late in development with both games to flesh out and establish story foundation, rub some world building on gameplay elements that were in place. So that was my first official experience, and then around 2018 I decided to focus on a game that had been swirling around in my head for years, and that game was Neurocracy. And that's what the game looks like. It's basically a wiki hole from the future that you can fall into and solve a murder while you're down there. It's actually a website, so you can visit it right now if you want. I'm going to leave this slide up for a while so you can write it down. And it's the game that I've always wanted to make, the game that I always wanted to play. I'm still astounded that it actually exists. And with your indulgence, I'd like to ramble on about how it was developed and how I released it episodically last year. Because I think that a personal story about a specific game being developed can be just as universally instructive and inspiring as a career's worth of advice spanning multiple projects. So the development of Neurocracy began over 20 years ago with two specific games, and the first game was Deus Ex. And that's a game that I played and endlessly replayed because I fell in love with its grounded, near-future science fiction setting. I especially loved exploring that world through all the in-universe text, like all the data logs, data cubes, terminals, newspapers, because piecing those puzzle pieces together gave me a snapshot of the world. And I think that sort of prompted me to start creating a science fiction world of my own, inspired by Deus Ex and dealing with very similar themes like pandemics, AI, transhumanism, and dystopia. And also, I just loved the acronyms in that game. UNATCO, the NSF. I think there's so many acronyms in Neurocracy, and I think Deus Ex is to blame. The other game that inspired Neurocracy directly was Half-Life. I would struggle to tell you which of these two games is my favorite. I guess if you put a gun to my head, I would say, please don't kill me. I put Half-Life next to Deus Ex because I fell in love with its lore just the same, but Half-Life was the game that really taught me that if I wanted to go out there and make something of my own, I could do that. Because I became active in Half-Life's modding community, first as a modeler, but soon I was sort of leading an enthusiast team of coders, modelers, and mappers to make a single-player modification, sort of like the Opposing Force and Blue Shift expansion packs, where you play a new viewpoint character on the Black Mesa incident. This time you're a Russian spy who has infiltrated the Black Mesa facility to steal the secrets of teleportation, and then when the resonance cascade happens, you have to escape while maintaining your cover. I mention it because this was sort of a first real community, the modding community of Half-Life, that I felt like I belonged in. Where I lived, there wasn't a lot of opportunity to make friends that I could connect with. So this was a real first sense of community. And at the age of 15, the experience of leading a team to make a game. So I didn't know what I was doing, but nobody told me not to. So that mod project didn't really go anywhere because it was just a lot of ideas without really executing on any of them. So I immediately decided to not learn my lesson and start an even bigger project, this time a Half-Life 2 single-player modification called Omnius Global. Now, Omnius Global is the name of an evil mega-corporation that I was dreaming up as part of this Deus Ex-inspired sci-fi world. And just like the previous project, didn't really go anywhere. The only development that it saw was a single character model. This is Spencer Hagen, the evil CEO of Omnius Global. Fun fact, that's actually my dad. He provided the likeness for the character model, and if there is something to unpack about me casting my dad in the role of an overbearingly evil authority figure, I don't think we have the time to. So that project didn't really go anywhere either, but it did produce 2 pieces of writing that ended up laying the groundwork for Neurocracy. And the first was a screenplay that I wrote to plot out the story from start to finish. That was an approach sort of inspired by Mark Laidlaw, the lead writer of the Half-Life franchise, because he would write these little vignettes, these little set pieces, sort of as tone, to set the tone or establish a character relationship without the expectation that those scenes would be directly translated to the game. So I extrapolated that approach and wrote an entire screenplay. This is it. It's absolute dog shit. It's over 240 pages, so I'm over like a 4-hour movie. It has overlong exposition scenes and monologues, no meaningful female characters to speak of, and a lot of action and stealth encounters contrived to make the player face dozens of enemies. I think the main character was called Thomas Norwood. So as dubiously as I look back on that screenplay now, I mean, I was proud of it at the time. I had it printed. It was the first time that this sci-fi world that I was putting together in my head coalesced into something concrete, something finished from beginning to end. And then the second piece of writing that came out of Omnius Global really should have been a clue, because it was a lore bible of Omnius Global's world-building details, formatted like a wiki. So I actually used the MediaWiki software to collate all these little world-building details, and I found out I was having a lot of fun making this wiki seem as authentic as possible. I would add logos and maps and diagrams and stock photos. So it took me, frankly, an embarrassingly long time to realize that I was staring at the first conceptual version of Neurocracy right there. And I remember when the idea came to me to let this wiki be the the narrative medium for my sci-fi world, because it happened right before I was going to bed, and I ended up just lying there staring holes in the ceiling while the narrative implications of this premise sank in. And the reason it was a sleepless night is because I was excited. I was energized by this idea, because it allowed me to first embrace world building, which is my favorite part of writing, and this was a way that I could front load that without having to write all that pesky prose. And the other thing is that my writing style tends to be, dry, matter-of-fact, encyclopedic, if you will. So this idea allowed me to embrace that to the fullest. As Mike Bithell mentioned in his talk yesterday, embrace the weird thing you do. So now I had a premise, telling a sci-fi story through a future Wikipedia, and everything else that I'd been sort of tossing around in my head kind of fell into place there. I was also lucky to have met someone in the Half-Life modding community, my friend Matej, who was also an excellent web developer. So I approached them, and they agreed to help me build Omnipedia. Interesting fact, Omnipedia was actually going to be the name of the project, but because that's also the name of the encyclopedia in the Star Trek universe, we went with something else to avoid confusion and possible copyright infringement. But if you go to Wikipedia and you put Omnipedia in the search bar, you will get to the Neurocracy article, because someone added a redirect from Omnipedia. And I had nothing to do with that, nor any other part of this article. I'm so glad it exists, because it's like the best compliment that Neurocracy could have ever received. So now Matej and I were starting development, and immediately our first and biggest rule was that we could only use narrative systems that Wikipedia already has. The reason for that is because there's an immediate literacy there. We're all familiar with Wikipedia, we've all gone down wiki rabbit holes, and that became the gameplay mechanic. The gameplay model of Neurocracy is the wiki rabbit hole. So there's an immediate literacy there, the grammar of interaction with Neurocracy was immediately familiar, and there's no need for a tutorial or a lengthy manual. And initially, we were going to make Neurocracy as like an aftermath story, like Omnipedia is available to you on a single date after everything has happened, and you jump from article to article to figure out how all those pieces fit together. That became an issue of how do we gate information? How do we stop players from spamming random article until they find the one with all the answers? Another issue was that it rendered the text static, whereas Wikipedia is known for its very dynamic information, editing wars. So we implemented Wikipedia's revision history so we could illustrate differences between article edits. With every article on Omnipedia, you can go back and forth and find different versions, see what's been edited, and then it's up to you to figure out why. And that also enabled us to have an episodic release model, and it underscored the themes of the story world of Neurocracy, because it's about governments and corporations obscuring the truth to hide their actions. So depicting that in an editing war felt very appropriate. It's basically story and gameplay married and form and content reinforcing each other. Another system of Wikipedia that we were looking at was the article previews. Yes, I used the Neurocracy article to illustrate. The article previews sort of solved a couple of problems altogether, because initially we were thinking of linking out to actual Wikipedia from our Omnipedia, but that was immediately a problem. It took people out of the future, it sent them into a different wiki hole. So when we adopted the article previews, it solved that problem, because we had a method of briefly illustrating present-day concepts that we wanted players to learn about, and we could also update those to the future of that we were depicting in the year 2049. So if you now go and look for the article preview for the United Kingdom on Omnipedia, you will know what it looks like in the year 2049. Another thing that these article previews solved for us, it was enabled an interesting narrative mechanic, because every article on Omnipedia depicts something fictional. So if you see an article preview in one episode, it might very well turn into a full article in a subsequent episode. I think the first episode had about 9 articles, whereas the last one, the 10th one, had 40. They were gradually released across the episodes. So that made sure that each article preview could potentially turn into a full article. And the community actually started looking forward to specific articles based on those previews. It made sure that they acted as little teasers, and suddenly there was no distinction between these article tooltips and like hyperlinks to get you to a different article, which means that everything on Omnipedia was equally important. Everything could be a potential clue. And so then we had a prototype. This is what it looked like back then, pretty close to the real thing, with some stock photos as placeholder art. And while we were putting this prototype together, we were also trying to position it, like how do we sell this? What genre do we fit it in? Does it need to be fit into a genre? And this tweet from Sam Barlow pushed us in the right direction, sort of framed Neurocracy as an interface game, and us to learn about epistolary novels. And through that tweet, actually, we sort of embedded ourselves into the interactive fiction community, where we pitched Neurocracy and got great feedback from people like Emily Short and Andrew Plotkin. And another designer who was very influential in that way is Tom Francis, who has like amazing design talks on YouTube. And he posits a class of games called information games, where the goal is you find information, but then you use that information in the pursuit to form theories, and then you can go on looking for more information. That felt like it fit Neurocracy to a T. And that landed us in the ballpark of these games, like Her Story, Heaven's Vault, Return of the Obra Dinn, and Outer Wilds. It's no coincidence that these are mostly some variety of detective game, because Neurocracy also had a murder mystery as its central hook, its central story arc. Through the interactive fiction community, we had also learned of IntroComp, which is like a contest where contributors can upload the first part or any part really of their interactive fiction game, get feedback, and then use that feedback for the finished product. So we entered our Neurocracy prototype into 2019's IntroComp and ended up winning 3rd place, but more important than that was the feedback that we got, because we actually got the perfect review from Felicity Drake. As far as I can tell, Neurocracy is not interactive in the sense that the player can have an impact on the narrative, but the whole effect is so brilliant, the concepts and writing so solid, that I don't mind the lack of interactivity. And it does feel wonderfully interactive to piece together theories about the mystery from information scattered through the articles. That really drove home that what we were building made sense, and people were picking up what we were putting down. So with that working prototype and all that feedback, we approached publishers. They all said no. They really liked the idea, but it was too experimental. They didn't really know how to position it, and it was a website, so you can't really put that on Steam. But ultimately, I think that was the best thing that could happen, because it allowed us to self-publish Neurocracy, and we had that freedom. We were only beholden to ourselves. Because if a review says that your game is not for everyone, I consider that a compliment. So one of the publishers that we were talking to suggested crowdfunding and self-publishing. So we went to Kickstarter. We pulled together £12,000 to pay our contributors. But more than that, ahead of the Kickstarter, we put together a community, because you can't just launch a Kickstarter and expect everyone to start pledging. You need to get some interest going. You need to pull together a community. And we used that to sort of test our episodic release model. So we released 4 episodes over as many months and in a Discord server. And there we found like a very small scale version of what the actual release would look like. Sort of, I think about 100 people joined the Discord, and a few members of those contributed theories with every release. So that was another proof of concept for us. After the Kickstarter, we were also able to afford other writers to come in and contribute articles, because the medium also makes it in sort of an anthology. And those writers were all absolutely amazing. There was Lee Alexander, Malka Older, Yutanjaya Vijaratne, Io Black, Ed Smith, and Axel Hassan Tayari. And I came at them by giving them an overarching, sort of a broad view of what the world of Neurocracy was like, but then I gave them free rein to write what they wanted. And through them, the world of Neurocracy came back to me through fresh eyes, and that was something I desperately needed at that point, because I was staring myself blind on it. So with all those stories, there was like an AI-hosted reality show, a Doom Funeral Dirge Band, the first female Prime Minister of India, and those stories all came back to me, parts of the world of Neurocracy that I myself could have never conceived. So with all those moving parts in place, we were ready for release. We released the first episode on July 14th, 2021, and this is what it looked like. So here, there's already 6 paths that the player can take. They can go for the main murder mystery in the news box. They can go for a different kind of murder mystery for the AI-hosted reality show in the featured box. They can also go into the past, previous versions of the main page, which will have different news articles and a different featured article. They can go click on random article and start with that one. They can click on About Omnipedia and learn about the actual website and how it works. Or they can go into the search box, put in any term, and see where and how it occurs across Omnipedia. So we explicitly wanted to, don't handhold the player, just allow them free reign within Omnipedia. And immediately we realized depth and the extent to which this community came together to find theories even after the first episode. Because we used the same Discord server, so we had kind of an idea of what it would look like, but we greatly underestimated the depth to which the community went with that first episode. And along the way, they started putting together mind maps, conspiracy walls, node graphs. They started archiving Omnipedia between episodes just in case there was some information that would later be deleted. There was. So that was incredibly heartening in those first couple of weeks because when you stare yourself blind on a project, you don't really have an idea of how it's going to be taken. So that was incredibly validating. Right. So the way the gameplay model then evolved, and actually I only discovered it while it was happening during release, is that I had to find sort of a balance between the cohesion of a scripted drama and the humming electrical possibility space of the community supplying theories. It became sort of a tabletop role-play gaming campaign, but in more like an alternate reality game. So I coined this. I told you that I'm a really big fan of acronyms. So I think TTARG really describes the gameplay model that we established with Neurocracy. It became sort of about finding storytelling in the ambiguity, because I had a lot of clues prepared for each episode, but then when I saw the depth to which the community was already making connections, I pulled back and allowed them to find those interpretations. And it made them feel great for figuring stuff out on their own. I was also very lucky that this was mostly a self-moderating community. I didn't really have to go in and moderate, because if the verbs of your game are not shooting people in the face but going on a wiki dive together, you tend to invite a specific type of player. And so it was incredibly heartening to see everybody sort of helping each other out. If someone came in a later episode, they were immediately told where to go and what had been happening. People were making jokes. They were correcting each other on the non-binary pronouns of some of Neurocracy's characters. So that was incredibly amazing and heartening to see. Also because we could not comment on anything that was being said. We could only observe and then feed those theories back with each episode. People told us that they were sad when it was going to be over, that when the last few episodes were going to land, they wished that it would keep going. People told us that it was the highlight of their summer. They told us that they had made friends along the way. And it's that energy, that community coming together over those 10 weeks that gave me the drive to keep it going, because honestly, I need deadlines to really get something written down. So a lot of the later episodes weren't written. I had to just go week by week and write articles based on the theories that the community was providing. And even if I wasn't really explicitly taking them in, just reading those theories day by day, I think put them in the back of my head and sort of infused the writing of each subsequent episode. And I didn't know that was going to happen until it was happening. I also, so when I said that was the energy that kept me going throughout those 10 weeks, I also want to point out that my partner was a great beacon of support throughout Neurocracy. And this is her, actually, 30 years into the future, still a fox. Because we had decided to create a character based on her. She's now a Venezuelan sociologist and activist. And I mention it because we sort of put her history in Venezuela into the character. So if you go to her article, you will find that it's a genuine information about what's been happening there. And it was just so amazing to be able to tell that story together in this context. A few other articles I want to highlight. I got to write an article about a near-future Terminator movie called Skynet. That was something that initially I allowed myself for fun, but then it started being incorporated into the theories anyway. So suddenly some characters became time-traveling AIs. That wasn't intentional, but it was beautiful to see how even this article was incorporated in everything. And this, I also want to highlight Ephraim Waite, who is a doom funeral dirge musician written by one of the contributing authors. And I want to highlight them because this became sort of the breakout character where every episode would release and immediately people would go on Ephraim Watch. What's been happening with Ephraim? Let's go to that article. They would have like little seances to see if Ephraim was still alive. So those 10 weeks, if this talk is in any way chaotic, it's to represent how chaotic those 10 weeks were. So real quick, what is the future of Neurocracy? Well, we currently have a Patreon going. I'll leave that up so you can write it down. Because if this sounds at all appealing, if this kind of community, crowdsourced, detective work sounds at all sort of appealing to you, we're going to launch it again next year with an updated mystery, taking all the theories that the community gave us and incorporating them so both veterans and newcomers will be surprised. So we're doing that in summer 2023, so you can already block out that time. Finally, I was thinking, like, what's the takeaway that I want people to have? And I had a couple, like, trust your audience, trust your team, embrace the weird thing you do, limitations breed creativity, don't kill your darlings, put them in a separate text file. But ultimately, what I really want to leave you with is talk about your work early and often, because that's the thing that really made Neurocracy happen. Because remember how I started this talk by saying it wouldn't have happened without AdventureX? Well, basically, I think it was 2016, 2017, when AdventureX was being held in Goldsmith University, when I was lining up outside, and someone next to me started talking to me. And I, like, as the socially anxious beast that I am, was like, ugh. But they started asking what I was working on. And suddenly I felt compelled to start talking about Neurocracy. And that gave me sort of an impetus to then go in and mention this project to people. And I spoke to Dave Gilbert. I think at the pub, I pitched it to a slightly drunk John Ingold. And all that feedback, all that enthusiasm for the project was so instrumental in giving me the drive to actually make it. And because you can keep a project in the drawer forever, and showing something when it's ready is a completely arbitrary goalpost. So if you have something you're working on, tell people about it, because you will gain motivation, you might even gain teammates, you will land in amazing communities. And yeah, so who knows, maybe at some point I'll be there to talk about your game. So I really hope that you have enjoyed mine. Thank you very much.